Hello, my name is Daniel Hill. I'm the chair of the Tyndale Fellowship Study Group for Philosophy of Religion, and I'd like to give a little talk today about temptations facing academics. I don't claim to be an expert on temptation. If you want an expert, I've got three for you here. They are all works from long ago, and I've chosen them because they're freely available on the web, so you shouldn't have to pay any money to read them. First off, William Bridge in 1649 wrote a 94-page treatise on temptation. And then just 3 years later, Thomas Brooks wrote a 225-page treatise entitled Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices. John Owen, you may have heard of him, one of the greatest British theologians, in 1658, 6 years later, wrote a 205-page work called Of Temptation, which is a study of just one verse in the Bible, Matthew chapter 26, verse 41. Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And that was abridged in 2007 by the Ban of Truth in a 120-page book. And that was further outlined in a 9-page outline, which is online. There have, of course, been many more books and studies since then, but these are just ones that I've picked out as being freely publicly available. Although I say I'm not an expert on temptation, I have been tempted in most ways that I outline in this little presentation. And in many cases, I've given in to the temptation. But I don't think it'd be appropriate to use myself as an example in every case. I'm not using the examples that I plan to give in this presentation in order to get at the people in question. I use these examples simply to show how easy it is to fall to the temptation. And do bear in mind that the people that I mentioned may have repented since then. First of all, what is temptation? Let's look at a passage from the New Testament, from the book of James, chapter 1, verses 13 to 14. This is from the NIV. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. So in temptation, a sin is held out to the mind as something enticing, attractive. Now it's Satan, not God, that holds out the temptation. But Satan doesn't do so outside the will of God. God uses the devil's temptations for our growth. Satan, of course, has the opposite intention. He uses them to try and bring us down. God uses them, the same temptations, to try and build us up. If one wills to do the sinful action, then one falls to temptation. And in fact, this is true even if one can't actually do the sinful action in question. If I'm tempted to drive at 100 miles an hour in my car and I try to do so and then find that I can't drive at 100 miles in my car because it's not good enough, then assuming it's a sinful action to drive at 100 miles an hour, I've still fallen to the temptation even though I couldn't actually do it. Now, Jesus was tempted, but he never willed to sin, and he never fell to any of the temptations to which he was subject. Let's have a look at those temptations now. There's two parallel accounts of Jesus' temptations in the Gospels. I'm just going to go for the one here from Luke, but we could have talked about Matthew 1 instead. So this is Luke chapter 4, verses 1 to 12. Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, left the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where for 40 days he was tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and at the end of them he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone." The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, "I will give you all their authority and splendor. It's been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. The devil led him to Jerusalem and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. If you are the Son of God, he said, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you carefully. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. Jesus answered, it is said, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, not everything about Jesus' temptations as recorded there was bad. Jesus was no doubt attracted by the thought of eating. Note that there's a reason why the Bible reminds us of Jesus being hungry then. And eating isn't wrong. So it wasn't wrong that Jesus was attracted by the thought of eating. Similarly, being attracted by authority and splendor wasn't sinful for Jesus. He was entitled to receive both authority and splendor. And even being attracted by the prospect of being lifted up by angels was not sinful for Jesus. The sin would have been to have taken the devil's means to a permissible end or goal. Let's look at another temptation from the life of Jesus. This is from Luke chapter 22, verses 41 to 42 in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Now, Jesus is naturally attracted by the prospect of avoiding pain, and avoiding pain is not in itself sinful. But Jesus never wills to avoid the pain in a way contrary to his Father's will. That would have been a sin. We've been talking about Jesus' temptations, but the scriptures also talk about temptation in general, and I'd like to give us 3 reassurances and 1 warning from the scriptures before we look at some more particular temptations from our own lives. So first of all, from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. From Hebrews chapter 2, verse 18, for because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help, this is Jesus, he's able to help those who are being tempted. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who, in every respect, has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And finally, a warning from Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Now I want you to remember, not everything a temptation for one person is a temptation for everybody. For example, getting drunk can be a temptation. It can be enticing for one person, but might not be for somebody else. It might just not entice them at all, that prospect. Also remember that different people have different responsibilities. It might be wrong for somebody married with children to stay out late carousing, for example, but it might not be wrong for somebody footloose and fancy-free. Now, although temptation is different from sin, it can be irresponsible to put yourself knowingly in a position of temptation. For example, it can be irresponsible to go to a bar if you find drunkenness enticing. But equally, you shouldn't restrict other people's freedom if possible. So if somebody doesn't find something enticing that you happen to find enticing, that's not a reason for you to stop them from putting themselves in that position if they're not going to be tempted, we think. But finally, a warning here from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. If you think you're standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. Okay, there's lots of temptations that are pretty much common to most jobs and walks of life, and I don't plan to discuss these general temptations in the generality much. I'm planning to focus on things that are more specific to academia or more prominent in academia. So I'm not going to talk too much about temptation to be angry with one's co-workers, or to be proud of one's achievements, or to be jealous of others' achievements, or to temptation to get ahead in work, whatever the cost, or to have an affair with a co-worker, or to gossip, or to go along with the immoralities of one's co-workers. I'm planning just to focus on things that are more distinctive to academia. Some of these perhaps are distinctive, and I'll come back to that, but the plan is to talk specifically about academic type temptations. I like this little meme very much, and I thought I'd preface my talk with it because it shows nicely the emotional ups and downs of academia. So here we've got this child with all these learned tomes in front of him, and he's the caption is, "When I accidentally solve a math problem." And you can see what's in the child's head. "I'll top this year, I can solve more, I think I'm a genius, knowledge is power," and so on. And the reason why I like this is because I think it kind of reflects how I feel, and maybe how you feel too, that I kind of accidentally solve a problem and I feel fantastic for a little while, and then reality comes back and I spend a long time struggling with the problem without success, and I think the opposite of these things, that I'm hopeless and a failure and all that kind of thing. So beware of the emotional ups and downs. Okay, I'd like to start by discussing the temptation of pride. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, that is a temptation, of course, that faces everybody, not just academics, but I think it is actually particularly acute for academics, and here's an example that shows why. This is an example from my own field of philosophy. Here's Friedrich Nietzsche, famous philosopher, and he was made a full professor and given an honorary doctorate at age 24, which is, of course, very, very unusual, fantastic scholarly achievement. But by 1888, these are the titles that he was giving to his book, to chapters in his book, Ecce Homo. Why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books. This was Nietzsche's last original book before he went mad. And as I reflect on that, I can't help being reminded of this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, knowledge puffs up. Seems to me that Nietzsche, of course, wasn't a Christian, that his father was, that Nietzsche seems to me to have been puffed up by knowledge, and I'm sad to say that I think that contributed to his going mad. Now, that was Nietzsche, wasn't a Christian, but the same temptation does, I think, affect evangelical Christians, but in a more insidious way. So here's some examples of things that I've seen on social media from evangelical Christians. I'm humbled to announce that my latest article has been accepted. I'm praising God for his goodness in granting me a personal chair. And I've really seen these things, and they remind me a bit of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican in Luke chapter 18 and verse 11, and it makes me think that this is how they see it. The professor, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, road sweepers, refuse collectors, administrators, or even like this, undergraduate. Now, I accept that it is very difficult to draw the line sometimes. You may say to me, but I need to tell everyone how brilliant I am in order to attract PhD students. Or you may say to me, but if I'm the only one not doing it, then I'll not attract co-workers. So I get that it's very difficult to draw the line between legitimately celebrating the achievements that God's brought about in your life on the one hand, and being proud on the other hand. But there is a line, even though it's hard to draw, and I think that the examples I've given here fall on the wrong side of it. So just watch for that temptation. Self-importance is similar to pride, not quite the same. And the verse that springs to mind here is, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. That's Romans chapter 12, verse 3. And another example from my own field of philosophy here. Daniel Dennett did a survey of philosophers asking them, would you rather write a work that changes the world for the better forever and then is completely forgotten, or work that's so opaque and nuanced that it's still being read in 500 years' time? And apparently, everyone in the survey chose the second option. I think that if you're choosing not to change the world for the better forever, but choosing for your own name to be remembered even after you're dead, then you think of yourself more highly than you ought. Here's another example from a professor of philosophy at Yale on Twitter, as it used to be. This tweeter had 122,000 followers. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but he was a very successful philosophy professor and had a huge following on Twitter. And he tweeted this. He said, "I'd regard myself as an abject failure if people are still not reading my philosophical work in 200 years. And he followed it up with this. I have zero intention of being just another Ivy League professor whose work lasts as long as they're alive. That's never been my intention. I want a philosophy student in 2250 to stumble across my texts and be like, wow, this is insightful, like I felt with my heroes." Now, I'm not trying to get at this professor by quoting these tweets. My point is that these tweets there's a mixture of reaction in the philosophical community, but a lot of people thought, yes, that's exactly right. We do want to be read. Each of us does want to be read in 200 years' time. Of course, we want people to be reading our work in 2250. Some people did say, don't you think that's a touch arrogant? And I want to just ask you to reflect on those tweets in the light of do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Arrogance, not quite the same as pride or self-importance, but similar. Again, another example from my own field of philosophy. You can think for yourself why philosophy is producing so many examples of these temptations. Bertrand Russell, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, wrote in his autobiography, he wrote this is about himself as a young student. "Having been reading pantheism, I announced to my friends that I was God. They placed candles on each side of me and proceeded to acts of mock worship. Philosophy altogether seemed to me great fun." Now, what Bertrand Russell calls here great fun seems to me blasphemy. But note that Bertrand Russell, even looking back on this, doesn't see it as blasphemy, he just sees it as, a kind of young man's exuberance. And that's a temptation, I think, both to look back on it that way, but also at the time, which is my main point here, he was tempted in the heady study of philosophy to think that he was God, and his friends didn't say, no, don't be stupid, but they, went along with this what they thought no doubt was a game, but a game with a bit of point. But it isn't a game to blaspheme like this. Bertrand Russell, when he was later in life, didn't think he was God, but he didn't become a Christian, and as far as we know, and when he was asked what he would say if after dying he transported the presence of God, now he didn't believe in God, but he was asked to imagine this, they said, "How would you justify your failure on earth to be a believer, Russell?" And he said, "I'd say, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence." Well, I think you can hear the arrogance there, that we know that when we meet God on Judgment Day, both believers and unbelievers, nobody's going to be talking back to God like that. The only appropriate response will be to fall on our faces in front of him. It's not just Bertrand Russell. I'm taking an example here of somebody from the field of logic and computer science. I'll not tell you who he is. Again, he's not a Christian, but he's extremely eminent, as you can tell by the fact that he's authored over 450 research papers and over 30 research monographs, tremendous achievement, editor of several international journals and of many reference works, and he's the chair and founder of several international conferences. So one of the preeminent logicians and computer scientists of our time. And he said in an interview back in 2008, in a published interview, he said, "I'm collecting arguments against the Almighty because he's a very controversial figure. I think that he might postpone calling me to heaven just not to have the confrontation." Again, it seems to me just staggering, the arrogance here to think that God might be kind of too scared to call this person to heaven because he's frightened of being outwitted in an argument with a mere human. It seems to me this is certainly thinking of yourself more highly than you ought. Here's an example from the field of mathematics. When mathematician G.H. Hardy undertook a sea journey, which he was frightened of dying at sea, he would send a telegram that said to a friend that said, "Have solved Riemann hypothesis," which is a problem in mathematics. Stop. We'll give details upon return. Stop. And this was untrue. He made it up, told a lie. Why? The idea once again was to outwit God. In order not to be bested by Hardy, God would make sure that he didn't die, so that humans wouldn't be tormented by the idea of a lost mathematical proof. So even though Hardy was an atheist, didn't believe in God, he thought he could outwit the God that he didn't even believe in and get him to keep him alive at sea by perpetrating this hoax on the mathematical community, so that God would have to keep him alive in order to reveal that the hoax was just a hoax. Again, the kind of idea that mere humans can manipulate God in this way is a staggering, it seems to me, example of arrogance. One more example from my own field. This is from John Stuart Mill, a famous Victorian philosopher and 19th century, and he wrote this: "Whatever power such a being," so he's talking about God, "may have over me, there is one thing which he shall not do. He shall not compel me to worship him. I will call no being good who is not what I mean when I apply that epithet to my fellow creatures. And if such a being can sentence me to hell for not so calling him, to hell I will go." I hope you can see there, we don't need to get into the details, but the staggering arrogance of thinking that he can talk back to God and that he can refuse and that God won't be able to compel him to worship him. We know that actually at the last day every knee will bow, and if people like John Stuart Mill don't bow their knees freely, then they will be compelled to bow the knee, whatever they say in their philosophy books. Let's move on to a different temptation: snobbery. Snobbery is a big problem in academia. Academics often look down on people they regard as uneducated, and they also often look down on people they regard as popularizers. Let's go back to G.H. Hardy from mathematics, and this is what he wrote in the autobiographical section of his book, A Mathematician's Apology. He writes, "There is no scorn more profound, or on the whole more justifiable, than that of the men who make for the men who explain. Exposition, criticism, appreciation is a work for second-rate minds." Well, you can hear the scorn dripping from Hardy's words there as about the people that have to expound, criticize, and appreciate. But that's a hugely important part of scholarly life, and we know from the Bible that God has called people to be different parts of the body, to have different roles and ministries, and we're not supposed to look down on another part of the body and say, "We don't need you." But that seems to be exactly what G.H. Hardy is doing here in his snobbish way. Here's a more tricky example. Tricky because we don't know the full details of this, of the original incident here. But I've certainly heard this repeated by Christians, evangelical Christians, in a snobbish way, and it's upset me when that's happened. So this is a story about Bishop B.F. Westcott, who was formerly Regius Professor of Divinity at Cambridge University, so a very eminent theologian of his day. And he was asked by a keen new convert, "Are you saved?" The person asking didn't know who he was. And he answered, "Do you mean sozomonos, or sesosmonos, or sothezomonos?" Now, of course, Bishop Westcott's right that the Bible has different tenses of salvation, that those are three different Greek words that validly express different theological concepts. And that's important, but it seems to me, and this I've heard the anecdote told, that the idea is that here we, such clever and sophisticated Christians, putting down the naive new believer. But that's not a Christian approach, to put down the zeal of the fresh convert with your scholarship. Sure, if you think that's appropriate, educate the new convert, teach them the way of God more adequately as you see it, but don't put them down, humiliate them by your cleverness and your superior knowledge. That's not the way of Christ. Here's another more recent example. This is from Professor Don Carson, who was a witness to this exchange. And I'll not tell you who the person is here, but it concerned a world famous academic expert on the New Testament. And in this conference, a graduate student had asked this world famous academic expert on the New Testament a tricky question. And the expert said, rather than answering the question, said, "Have you read all the background texts in the original Aramaic?" And the poor graduate student said, "Well, no, sorry, I haven't done." And the world famous academic expert then said, "Well, you don't have the right to ask the question. Next." So here we can see the kind of snobbishness that you won't even engage with people that, in your view, don't meet up to a certain academic criteria. A different temptation, but related, is the temptation to overprize the intellectual. Many academics are interested only in clever people, not godly people or even nice people, just clever people. And they measure their own worth and the worth of other people just by how clever they are, or how many qualifications or how many publications they have. Here's some examples of this, one from my own field. This is from the young David Lewis, one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest philosopher of the last 35 years or so. And when he was young, he wrote this: "I can see no other meaning in life except the gaining of knowledge. But this is rather meaningless, a rationalization of the fact that I've devoted myself so much to the gaining of knowledge, to the over-exclusion of other aspects of life." I pay tribute, by the way, to the self-awareness there of the young David Lewis, that he realized actually that it wasn't a fulfilling life just to be focused on the gaining of knowledge. But I think quite a lot of academics are in this boat, that they do fail to see any other meaning except the gaining of knowledge. Or like David Lewis here, if they do realize, they are kind of unable to tear themselves away from the study of knowledge to look at the other things that they realize might be there. From the field of mathematics, mathematician Paul Erdős said he used to use the word died to mean left maths. And if somebody really did die, he would say that they'd left. So notice how he switches the words round there, the terms round, because for him, maths is more important than life. Another example from mathematics, the German mathematician David Hilbert had on his tombstone, "We must know, we will know," in German, of course. Well, leave aside for a moment the kind of arrogance of "we will know, we must know," that you feel that you've kind of, that humanity is entitled to know all the answers to these questions. But notice that he wants on his tombstone the idea about knowledge. It's not "we must love, we will love," but "we must know, we will know." Now, those people weren't evangelical Christians, but the temptation of over-intellectualizing does affect evangelical Christians too. Here's some ways in which it can manifest itself. You might expect the sermon in church and want the sermon in church to be like a lecture, academic in tone. Or you might, when you're reading the Bible, be interested in reading academic Bible commentaries on what you read, but not devotional material. Stuff, getting into all the weeds of the intellectual discussions of the meaning of the original languages and all that kind of thing, but not stuff to build you up in Christ. I mean, they can have both, of course, but you might be tempted just to focus on the first. And when you read your Bible, you might be tempted to focus just on the stuff that you regard as really intellectual, like Paul's letters, for example, you might think, and you might not be so keen on spending time studying stuff that you regard as not intellectual. Maybe you think the Psalms and the wisdom literature are not, intellectual enough for you, not compared with Paul's letters anyway. Maybe when you go to church, you find yourself bored by praise and worship, for example, just you're waiting there for the intellectual stuff. Maybe you regard yourself being uninterested in fellowship after church services. So I know an evangelical Christian that boasts of preferring to be on the sound desk in his church services so he doesn't have to interact with people. Now, I know that God's made us all different, right? So not everybody's, an extrovert. Not everybody likes meeting new people, so on. I get that, and that's part of our divinely given personalities. But you shouldn't boast of being like that, okay? If God's made you such a way that you don't um, like socializing, that's not something kind of to be proud of. I mean, I'm not saying be ashamed of it, but it's not. It's just, it's not something um, that you should be prizing, above the person that's got a different personality and likes meeting other people and so on. So just be careful of that kind of temptation. And by the way, when this evangelical friend of mine boasted about this, lots of other people chimed in on social media saying, yeah, that's dead right, I'm exactly in that situation, or thought this was a good joke rather than actually a kind of a potential problem. Finally, a more subtle perhaps temptation to over-intellectualize is to think that if we can't see a good reason for something, maybe God gives in the Bible a certain command and we can't see why he chose to give that command. Well, God can't have meant it that way because we can't see why it should have been that way. Again, this is perhaps an example of arrogance, maybe actually rather than over-intellectualizing, because we're thinking, look, if we can't see it, then there can't be an explanation. But that's crazy when you stop thinking about it. Why should we think that everything that the Almighty God thinks is accessible to us? Here's a story from evangelical Christian Mark Dever, a pastor in the United States now, but he was studied at Cambridge in Britain, at Cambridge University, and he tells the story in one of his books. I once had a friend who worked for a campus Christian ministry while attending a church where I was a member. He would always slip right in after the hymns, sit there for the sermon, and then leave. I asked him one day why he didn't come for the whole service. Well, he said, I don't get anything out of the rest of it. Now, I want you to note here that this friend is a mature evangelical Christian who actually works for a campus Christian ministry, a well-known one in Britain, in fact. And this person's attending an evangelical church. But yet, this person is only interested in the intellectual aspect of the sermon, not interested in praise and worship, not interested in fellowship. And note this person's justification. I don't get anything out of the rest of it. No thought for glorifying God, honoring him, no thought for edifying brothers and sisters. Just it's all about self. And this is an evangelical Christian that's so mature they've got a job working for a campus ministry. Here's an example from a philosopher from my own field, Peter van Inwagen, a Christian, still alive, retired now, and he puts this in his autobiography. Now, because it's in the public domain, I don't mind reading it out using it as an example, but this is something I want to stress that Peter van Inwagen's kind of repented of, the envy that he describes here, but I've included it because I think he expresses very well how a lot of people feel from time to time anyway. My researches, I think, went very well indeed, but I haunted my departmental mailbox mostly in vain and was subject to frequent periods of depression and spasms of anger because of my lack of professional recognition. The anger was directed at certain of my former teachers, more famous ones, who, I believed, were in a position to advance my career, and yet were doing nothing for me. I believed they just didn't see how good I was and wasted their influence in advancing the careers of people who were less good than I. I was never jealous of these other people, only envious. I didn't want them not to get what they got, but I wanted some too. Now, I want you to note there that, by the way, we give thanks that Peter van Inwagen was actually spared from the temptation for jealousy. He had the temptation to envy and fell to that. But many of us have gone further. I mean, I must confess I've sometimes not only wanted to have the academic success that other people I know have had, but I've actually wanted them not to have it, which he didn't have that latter part. I've thought, such a person shouldn't get that success, he's not entitled to that honor. They're not good enough. And that's a terrible thought because we should be happy with the estate that God's given to us in life. Maybe he's called you not to a high and mighty position, but to a humble position. You shouldn't be bitter and resentful about that, but you should accept where God's put you, even if he's put other people that you think are less gifted in a higher position as the world sees it. I mentioned resentment there, and that's a separate temptation, I think, in its own right. And it can come about not just from envy and jealousy, but actually from other things. After the heady delights of university research, it can be easy to resent things like feeding the baby, washing the dishes, or sweeping the floor. These normal everyday tasks can seem so inconsequential, even meaningless. Here's an example from the famous logician and computer scientist I mentioned before from an interview that he gave. He says, as I was going out with my wife and we were walking from one part of the university to another part, my objective was to get from A to B. She wanted to stop and look at the moon because it looked very nice. And I thought, what should I want to look at the moon for when I want to go to B? And he says later in the same interview, to pay the bills, to check whether the amounts are correct, etc. That is something I hate doing. It requires thinking, and thinking I keep for logic. So I want you to see here how easy it is to be tempted to resent the fact that your spouse wants to stop and look at the moon when you're a busy academic and you need to get to another part of the university, or to resent having to do humdrum jobs like paying the bills because that's not your primary calling as you see it. Now, I'm not saying you have to like paying the bills. All I'm saying is be careful it doesn't turn into bubbling resentment, which is going to have a bad effect on your spiritual life. A very different temptation now, the temptation to think that everything's a subject for knowledge, even the second coming. Now, you may well remember that in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, we read, now concerning that day and hour, the day when the Lord Jesus is due to return, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father only. Now you might think, that's very clear. Surely nobody can make a prediction of the time of the second coming. Well, a lot of people have done so, and a lot of heavy-duty, impressive academics. So here's some examples. Johannes Stoeffler, in the 16th century, professor at Tübingen, predicted that Jesus would come back on the 20th of February, 1524. Michael Stiefel, professor of maths at Jena, very important university, in the 16th century, predicted that Judgment Day would begin at 8 a.m. on the 19th of October, 1533. Alsted, a reformed professor of theology and philosophy at the Herborn Academy, predicted in the 17th century that the millennium will start in 1694. Isaac Newton, perhaps the greatest mathematical physicist ever, predicted when he was professor of maths at Cambridge that Jesus would return in 2060. He wasn't a Christian, but Timothy Dwight, he was Arian, but Timothy Dwight IV was an evangelical Christian, reformed, and he was president of Yale, and he predicted that Jesus would return in the year 2000. Now you might say, well, that's all a long time ago. Nobody's as silly as that these days. Frank Tipler, who's professor of maths and physics at Tulane, still going these days, he has predicted in his book, The Physics of Christianity, that Jesus will return in 2057. Okay. Connected with the idea that anything can be an object of knowledge is the idea that you can be objective about anything at all, leaving aside your Christian faith. So I hear sometimes people say things like this. I can objectively discuss Marxism or Darwinism or Freudianism or materialism, whatever the case may be, without mentioning my personal disagreement. Now, that may be true, but if you're doing that in a lecture, will the students, or if you're doing it in a book, will the lay readers of your work mistakenly take silence on your part to be consent? And are you going to mislead people by your silence? I get why people can not want to put their heads above the parapet here and want to be silent on these things, but I think it's important to remember that silence may not be neutral. It may in fact have a profoundly negative and problematic effect. Or people say, I can work on anything I like without it's affecting me personally. I can be academically detached. Sir Anthony Beevor, one of the leading historians of our time, said about his definitive historical work, Stalingrad, about the siege of that city in the Second World War. He said, I had a bit of a nervous collapse after finishing that book. That was British understatement, by the way. He's actually described dissolving into tears in his publisher's office as he presented his manuscript. And I'm not surprised that it took an emotional toll on him, because there's so many horrors that took place in the siege of Stalingrad in war that I think almost anybody would be negatively affected by that. And I want to say to you now that if you think that you could work for 40 years on pornography, let's say, or arguments against the Christian faith, without it affecting your soul, I think you're deluding yourself, I'm afraid. A different temptation facing academics is rivalry. Now, in some ways, academia actually fosters great team spiritedness. For example, think of scientific teams working together. But in other ways, it can actually foster rivalry. If you don't believe me, here's an example. This story was told me by my friend, Professor Stephen Clark, and he knew about it because the culprit of the story actually boasted about it to him. So a candidate for a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, and by the way, if you don't know, a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford is one of the greatest academic achievements that one can have in Britain. This candidate took the opportunity during the formal dinner after the interview to kick his rival's shoes down the hall so that his rival had to suffer the indignity of walking out in his socks. His rival did not get the job, the shoe kicker did. And as I say, the shoe kicker actually boasted about this. He wasn't ashamed or embarrassed about this foul play, this underhand way of getting the role. He was proud of having been so quick-witted as to do this. Back a little bit before that, in 1820, philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer scheduled his classes at the same time as Hegel's lectures, hoping to steal his audience. And go back to G.H. Hardy again. He says in his book, Mathematician's Apology, to which I've already alluded, he says, when he's explaining why he wanted to go into maths, I wanted to beat other boys, and maths seemed to be the way in which I could do so most decisively. That's quite striking, isn't it? You might expect him to say, I wanted to go into maths because of the beauty of the subject, or because of the joy of pure logic or something. No, I wanted to beat other boys. Meanness, again, is a temptation that many academics sadly fall victim to. Here's an example from a professing Christian theologian. This is a review of this Christian theologian's book. The book claims that his intellectual opponents and their views are viciously vindictive, exquisitely malicious, exhibit specious reasoning, are inherently incredible, are morally obtuse, are ostentatiously absurd, exhibit extravagant absurdities, and are reflective of an intoxicating atmosphere of corroborating nonsense. The reviewer goes on. This list is by no means complete. These are merely the first few insults. We've just covered, as you see, 9 pages. In total, the book contains no less than 118 derogatory denotations of opponents, their theological views, their God, and their understanding of hell. And that's a professing Christian theologian that's written those 118 insults. And I personally saw a mature evangelical Christian say on social media, put the boot in, to another evangelical Christian about a review of a third evangelical Christian's work. I think the scriptures teach that we should try and correct our brothers and sisters, and we do have to correct them from time to time. I have to be corrected from time to time. But I think the scriptures teach we should try and do it in private, if possible, first, and gently, in a spirit of humility, and in order to edify them, not to put them down. But sadly, many academics enjoy the blood sport of seeing other academics getting ripped apart. A very different temptation facing academics is overwork. Now, it seems to me that academia is particularly prone to this because if you compare it with something like being a builder, most builders anyway, can't physically labour 16 hours a day. You know, their strength just gives out. They couldn't keep it up for a long time anyway. But scholars can physically labour 16 hours a day, or mentally labour 16 hours a day, and 7 days a week, even on the Lord's Day. The amount of work that one can do as a scholar is, in theory, unlimited. And because libraries and laboratories are often open 7 days a week, there's usually somebody working when one's trying to rest. And having email on one's phone makes it worse. One hears it pinging in and one begins to feel guilty that one isn't working when other people are. So temptation to overwork is a really big one, I think. Now, this isn't a temptation, but I wanted to include it because it's a big problem that a lot of academics, a lot of Christian academics face, and maybe some of you are facing. The pitfall of depression and loneliness. Although it's not a temptation, it can be connected with temptation to despair and things like that. A lot of Christian academics suffer from depression. It can be very lonely sitting in the library for hours on end just reading. And it can be frustrating that one's spouse or friends perhaps can't understand one's work. And the fact that academic work is difficult, often highly abstract, and often has no immediately apparent results, can also produce depression. Now, if that's you, please do get help. Churches should offer prayer. They may also offer counselling. Most universities have professional counselling services available to staff and students. There are also Christian counselling services that are available out there that can help you. You may also need medical help from a doctor. You may need antidepressants or something like that. So please don't be frightened to get help and don't neglect the God-given channels of help, both medical and spiritual. Try to make sure that you're making friends outside your academic discipline and at church. And try to make sure you do have a change of scenery occasionally. You take a rest from your work. The Bible commands us to work 6 days, but to rest 1 and 7. Try and set realistic goals and try and forgive yourself if you miss them. Please be assured of my prayers if this is your position. And it's a really important that you don't try and fight this alone, but try and get help. Okay, coming towards the end of my presentation, to switch to a very different temptation, the temptation for political correctness. Universities are very woke in the contemporary jargon, and the temptation to fall into line with wokeness is almost irresistible. I'm not saying, by the way, that everything called woke these days is wrong, far from it. But it seems to me that some of the things that are called woke do go against how I understand the scriptures to teach. But the temptation to fall in line is very strong. Nobody wants to be cold shouldered at conferences. Nobody wants to be the object of student protest saying ban the woke professor or sack the non-woke professor. And it's very tempting to go along with the consensus and not to speak out. And it's very hard to know when to speak out and when it's okay to be silent. And it's particularly difficult when failing to be woke is wrongly perceived as being unloving by many. That makes it particularly hard. You may think you're taking a stand for Jesus, and maybe you are, but maybe the students or your colleagues will think actually you're being unloving, you're being unkind, and that's a really, really hard situation to be in. Finally, a temptation that's very frequent among academics is obsessiveness and perfectionism. So, for example, one might think that in a talk on temptation, one has to list every single temptation. I want to finish with some good news before we get to prayer. Some temptations are rare in academia. You're very unlikely to encounter a culture of heavy drinking or drug abuse. Very unlikely to encounter, at least in Britain, maybe if you're not in Britain, maybe you have a slightly different experience. But this is my experience. Very unlikely to encounter, works outings to strip clubs or, casinos or places where you might be subject to temptation. Very unlikely to encounter dirty jokes being told by your colleagues or racist, sexist or homophobic banter. You're very unlikely to encounter temptation to see your life in terms of material possessions. Your colleagues are unlikely to be kind of pressing you about getting the latest car or having a big TV or a posh house or anything like that. Colleagues are very, very unlikely to be defrauding the university and trying to encourage you to defraud the university. They're almost all very honest. You're very unlikely to encounter lazy academics that are just free riding and getting paid for nothing. That's very, very rare. And it's very rare that you find, at least in my experience, corrupt superiors that reward only people that lie and cheat. That's all good news to counteract the more serious temptations that I've been talking about that sadly are quite common in academia. I want to conclude with some positive suggestions. First of all, as I mentioned just a moment ago, prayer. It's really, really important that you pray. You should watch out for temptation. Don't wait for it to flower and don't say, well, it's not wrong to do this, because temptation often works gradually. Here's another quotation from Bertrand Russell's autobiography. Now, Bertrand Russell, as I said, wasn't a Christian, as far as we know, never converted, but in earlier life, he did actually profess belief in God, professed to be a Christian, and he writes this about those times in his autobiography. I've been rendered very unhappy by the gradual loss of my religious belief, but when the process was completed, I found to my surprise that I was quite glad to be done with the whole subject. Now, note there that if the devil had come to Bertrand Russell and when he was professing Christianity and said, bin it all, become an atheist, that temptation might well have failed. But because the devil tempted him with gradual loss of religious belief, each step made another step possible. And that is very subtle, and that's something you've got to watch out for. Please do share your struggles with trusted others if possible. Try to follow Jesus' example and speak scripture into temptations. Don't give up hope. Please remember the promises at the start. And to go back to my first bullet point here, please pray. Fall on the Lord. Ask him to show you the way out that we had in that scripture, that Lord will provide you with a way out under temptation, and ask him to give you the strength to bear up under temptation and to build you up through the experience. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you find this helpful, and I pray that you will be spared falling into temptation in your life, and that the temptations that I'm sure you'll inevitably encounter will be ones that God will use to build you up.